The Louisville Cardinals' loss to Stanford on Saturday was one of the worst losses in program history.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into this Sunday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. This is my fifth year covering the university, third year hosting this show, and I want to personally take the time to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Now, guys, today's episode of the show brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. All you have to do, visit FanDuel.com to get started. A lot of unpack from Louisville's 38-35 loss to Stanford on Saturday. Simply put, one of the worst losses in program history. We'll discuss everything that went wrong. We'll also explain how Louisville is being too unpredictable this season and why it has contributed to the lackluster 6-4 start. And then we'll identify the most alarming issues that arose from Saturday's game against Stanford. And I do want to apologize if I sound hoarse. It's because I am dealing with the yearly sinus issues that hit me in November and December. So I apologize for the inconvenience there. Please give me patience. I'm going to try to make it through the next 28 minutes or so without my voice cracking too much. So, but unfortunately, this is a very hard truth type episode. You know, it's going to be a lot of honest conversation, as it should be, because when you lose this type of a game, you have to have these conversations. And you have to call it what it is. Louisville suffered one of the worst losses in program history on Saturday. Cardinals went into the game against Stanford anywhere from a 19.5 to 20.5, maybe even 21.5 point favorite. I spoke on this show last week mentioning that I wasn't going to talk about why Louisville was going to win the game because we already felt like we knew that. We already felt like Louisville had this in the bag. And maybe that was the problem. But I did mention that Louisville can't overlook Stanford. It seemed like they did. I more so mentioned how Louisville, or what Louisville could do so that they could dominate. Because truthfully, I felt like Louisville was definitely going to win the game. One of the worst case scenarios for me was that they would win, but it wouldn't be all that convincing. And at the end of the game, I was just hoping that that was going to be the case. But unfortunately, the comeback was complete. What made this really challenging was the way in which they lost. Now, I didn't want to be too prisoner of the moment when talking about this loss, but as a fan for the past 20 years, you know, me only being 26, I didn't want to there's been a lot of football played before I was around, but this very well could be the worst loss in program history in my lifetime. It's definitely one of the worst losses in program history. And I mentioned it's not just the loss. It's the way they lost. They went down 10-0 early on. They ended up coming back, playing with the lead for most of the second half. They were up by 14 points. It was 35-21. 35-21 with 7 minutes to go in the game. 7 minutes to go in the game. Syracuse ended up scoring. It took them about, 4 minutes to do so. It took Syracuse about 4 minutes to score. And then Louisville, right after that, had to punt the football. It was a 13-yard drive. They had Duke Watson ran for 5 yards. Ja'Cory Brooks got the first down. And then right after that, they just kind of stalled out. They had to punt the ball. But nonetheless, they gave their defense a chance to make a stop. And Stanford went down with 4 minutes to go in the game and completed a 9-play, 76-yard touchdown drive. Again, Louisville had another chance, 45 seconds to go. They were moving the ball. They got the ball 1st and 10 inside of the Stanford 45-yard line. and they had 4 straight incomplete passes. They went for it on 4th down. Stanford got the ball at the 45, thinking no problem. There's 5 seconds to go. Daniels throws a pass to Emmett Mosley, gets a yard. Okay, that's okay. The game's going to go to overtime. No, Louisville commits a completely unacceptable, unnecessary roughness penalty that gives Stanford 15 yards. But even then, you're like, okay, this kicker has a career high of 51 yards. It's a 57-yard field goal. A blatant offsides gets them to the 52-yard field goal range, and he hits the field goal, and Louisville loses the game. And this was a culmination of just Louisville continually not able to get out of their own way. And that's been the storyline all year. All year long is Louisville won't get out of their own way. Now, a lot of that is on coaching, but it's not all on coaching. Some of that is on the players as well. It's on the whole team. Like, there's nobody that doesn't share blame. If you would have told me coming into this, hey, Louisville's going to score 35 points. Okay, Louisville probably wins that game by 14 or 21. Nope. They give up 38 points, which is the most that Stanford has scored this season. This is a Stanford team. Coming into this game, they were 2-7. They won the second and third games of the season, respectively, Cal Poly and Syracuse. They've lost their last 6 games coming into this game, and they were not competitive more often than not. At Clemson, 40-14 loss. Virginia Tech, 31-7 loss. 49-7 loss against Notre Dame. 40-14 again, or 40-10 against SMU. 27-24 against a bad Wake Forest team. 59-28 against NC State. So it was basically like Stanford was just begging for this season to be over with. And Louisville did what you couldn't do. I felt like for the most part, the Cardinals were unprepared. They didn't make, if they did make adjustments, the adjustments were pretty much ineffective in the second half defensively. And it felt like there was just a lack of urgency from this team. The coaching mishaps, the situational coaching proved to be costly again. The penalties piled up, and some pretty inexcusable penalties. Like, this was an inexcusable, unacceptable loss. The Cardinals got penalized 13 times for 102 yards. That is over double their season average. Louisville had to have an absolutely disastrous collapse to lose this game, and they did. Now, credit to Stanford, because Stanford made winning plays. They played with urgency, and you can't fault them for doing so. We're seeing a trend pop up. Go back to 2023. Louisville has a statement victory against Notre Dame. What happened immediately after that? They followed it up with an inexcusable loss at Pittsburgh, a team that ended up only winning 3 games last year total. One of them was Louisville. A game where nothing went right. You consistently shot yourself in the foot, and you lost the game. You sucked all of the momentum out of the program with that win for the time being. Now, we'll ended up making up for it at the end of last year, but excuse me, or right after that game, I should say, not the end of last year. But this year, you have the statement victory at Clemson. First time you've ever beat them in program history. Like, the vibes were like, oh, yes, we're back. This is finally the Louisville team that we expected to see. Only difference between 23 and 24, you didn't have a bye week in 23. But I mentioned a lot of eerily similar parallels can be drawn between last year's Pittsburgh game and this year's Stanford game. And unfortunately, the parallels are real now. They're tangible because you lost to a Stanford team that you shouldn't have lost to. Everything that went wrong, everything that could have went wrong. And once again, for the second straight year, you lost all the momentum that you had following a statement victory. And this time it's a little bit more challenging because you already had 3 losses to start the year. So we know that Jeff Brohm is one of the best head coaches when it comes to creating upsets. But one thing that people have been talking about is that Jeff Brohm's teams, at least at Purdue, always seem to lose some games that they shouldn't have. Now, it happened last year against Pittsburgh and against Kentucky. And it's happened this year against Stanford. and I know that we talk about every year there's a trap game for Louisville, and it struck this year too. These next 2 games are critical. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. If you're listening to this, you're as pissed off as I am. These next 2 games are critical. But what makes this challenging to talk about is how unpredictable this team has been this year. We saw against Clemson how when they're on, they can go toe-to-toe with the majority of the teams across the country. But when they're not on, things like Saturday can happen. We'll discuss more when we come back on today's episode of Locked On Louisville. Cardinal fans, our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate football fan isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. It takes a lot of energy to power through all those all-day tailgates, touchdown celebrations, or an agonizing second-half defeat, which is why they've created the Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like us, the fans who are first in the parking lot and are last to leave. We see you. You know what gave me a bit of Louisville fan fuel this week? The Louisville volleyball team handling business and doing what they can to give a little bit of positivity to a rather rough weekend for Louisville sports. 5 Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for your big tailgate or ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. That's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help keep you fueled through the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5 Hour Energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. Cardinal fans, thanks again for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. The Louisville Cardinals are now 6-4 with 2 games remaining. They are bowl eligible, but any chance, however small it may have been, to A, try to get into the ACC championship game, or B, try to get into the college football playoff as an at-large, they're gone. They're out the window. The only thing you're doing now is playing for pride and playing for some momentum into the offseason. So how have we gotten to this point? I think it all comes down to not knowing which Louisville team you're going to get each game. The team has been very inconsistent. Now, one of the only consistent things, unfortunately, is that Louisville has not been good to start games. Like outside of the game against Austin Peay and against Clemson, the Cardinals have been really lackluster out of the gate in almost every game this season. Like yesterday, 10-0 deficit right out of the gate. And it has been a recurring issue week after week after week. But for the most part, Louisville has been able to overcome some of those first quarter debacles, and they've able to come from behind and beat Virginia and beat Georgia Tech and beat Boston College. But it's also led to losses. SMU, Miami, Notre Dame, and now Stanford. Now, the difference in the Stanford game is that Louisville had a 14-point lead multiple times in the fourth quarter, and they weren't able to win the game. That's a whole different discussion. But this being unpredictable aspect of this team, it's hurting. And maybe unpredictable isn't necessarily the word, but that's sort of the way that I've chosen to describe it, because inconsistency is not really telling the full tale. Like, Louisville's been inconsistent, but sometimes that's what football is. Being unpredictable, I would kind of combine the two. Because you've seen, and this is sort of a Jekyll and Hyde issue from this season, is that when Louisville is on, they're really good. And they haven't been on much this season. They haven't been able to play a full dominant performance, but twice. maybe 3 times. Like, I'm going to put Austin Peay and Jacksonville State to the side for the moment. You look at the rest of the games, they've had one dominant performance. It was Clemson. Eerily enough, it was Clemson. The other wins, not dominant at all. In fact, almost coin flip type wins and coin flip type losses. So you see this sort of a high ceiling that this team has because you do have the talent, but you also have a considerably lower floor. Because when you're not on, like the good is really good, but the bad can be really bad. And that's been the issue here. But why is this? Like, why is this team so polarizingly different every single week? Well, I think it comes down to a couple things. You see this team playing really good because they have the talent. It's never been a question of talent. You have one of the best quarterbacks in the ACC. You have a really good running back. Now, I know he got hurt against Stanford, but Isaac Brown has been really good. And you've got really good running backs behind him. Duke Watson, Kewan Brown. You have great receivers in Ja'Cory Brooks and Chris Bell. You've got the talent on defense with Ashton Gelati and Quincy Riley. So the good is good. We know. I mean, it shouldn't really surprise anybody, but the bad has been alarmingly bad at times. And I think that I look at this from 3 different aspects. Number one, defensive issues when it comes to scheme. Like Louisville, I thought had a great plan going into the game against Clemson. And then for whatever reason, they did something that hasn't really been able to do all year. That no team's been able to do all year, and that is make the Stanford offense look good. Ashton Daniels looked like one of the best quarterbacks in the conference, and he's had a very rough season so far. He made some plays. He made plays with his legs. Whatever happened, Stanford's offense did what they needed to do. In the second half, if Louisville were to make adjustments, I didn't see them because they were pretty ineffective. So the defensive issues are kind of first and foremost, because for the most part, I don't have as much of a concern in the grand scheme with the offense outside of 2 parts, like offensive execution at times. Like we see, when Louisville needs a drive, sometimes they stall out. But I think that some of this offensive execution, like sometimes drops, penalties, sacks, you name it. But I feel like a lot of it falls on situational play calling. Like play calling has been an issue this season. I mean, we saw it, in the Notre Dame game. We saw it in the SMU game. We've seen it all year long. But you look at the Stanford game, and particularly at the end of the game, where Louisville had a 14-point lead multiple times. Like that final drive where Louisville is, or not the final drive. I apologize. Not the final drive. When Louisville ended up, you look at it where Stanford ended up cutting the lead or it was 35-21. Stanford ended up answering. Louisville answered with a Duke Watson run and then 4 straight passes. Okay. And that is what it is. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but I would have liked to have seen Louisville try to run the ball a little bit more because Duke Watson and Kewan Brown had been running the ball fairly well. And then after that, you have 1st and 10 from the Stanford 45. 2 of those throws, you threw it deep. And I know you have the mismatch with Ja'Cory Brooks, but situationally, you need about 10 yards to get into field goal range for Brock Travelstead to be able to try to hit a game-winning field goal. And fourth and 10, you went for it. But you still you threw the ball deep. And like I said, I don't hate the decision to go for it. I don't hate it because Stanford didn't have much time. But again, it felt like Louisville just couldn't get out of their own way. And I'm not sitting here suggesting on this show that I'm smarter than Jeff Brohm. I'm obviously not. One of us is coaching the game. One of us is talking about the other guy coaching the game. Like, it's, there's levels to this. But Brohm said it after the game that, basically paraphrasing here, coaching's got to be better. How many times have we said that this year? How many more times are we going to say that this year? But nonetheless, there's some things that were more alarming to me than others. And the first thing was the defense. We'll discuss when we come back on today's episode of Locked On Louisville. Today's episode of the show brought to you by FanDuel. Tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. All you have to do, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $100 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And before we head back from break, do want to tell you about our friends over at Game Time. With basketball up into the full swing of things now, there's no better place to get all of your basketball tickets than Game Time. Look, I know the Tennessee loss was frustrating, but please don't give up on this team 2 games into the year. Be sure to still go to games and support this team. The way that I go to games is by using the Game Time app. I can toggle the all-in pricing feature that removes the surprise fees at checkout. I can get panoramic views from my seats and much, much more. Do yourself a favor, guys. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. I don't know about you all, but since the game, which was about, a little less than 24 hours ago, I feel like the anger comes in spurts. Like, I get angry at different things at different times. Like, some things I'm angry, like, yeah, damn, Louisville had a 14-point lead multiple times. They end up losing. The defense struggled all game long. They had a couple stops, but for the most part, the defense. The lack of urgency. The situational play calling, you name it. What were the most alarming issues on Saturday? I think it starts with the defense. Let me paint the picture for you. Coming into this game, Stanford at 2-7 had scored more than 30 points once. That was against Cal Poly. Now, I made a comment that this was the most that Stanford had scored all season. I was not correct. They did score 41 against Cal Poly. The point remains that the most that they've scored since then, is 27 points. I'm sorry, 28 points. They scored 28 against NC State. 38 was the most that they've allowed, or the most that Stanford has scored against a Power 5 team all season. Let's go to that performance. Stanford had 406 yards of total offense. They threw the ball 323 yards and had 83 rushing yards. Ashton Daniels had 298 passing yards. That's the most that he's had all season by 77. This is the second game where he had more touchdown passes than interceptions. He had 3 touchdown passes and 1 interception. The interception was basically a ball that got taken from the wide receiver. It wasn't even like a bad throw. It was that the Stanford guy caught it and got the ball taken from him. He was 22 of 33 for 3 touchdowns. Now, Louisville did get into the backfield. The Cardinals got sacks, but they weren't able to get off the field. They gave up 38 points. They had multiple penalties. They just completely were not able to get off the field. Let's go to the second half. The Cardinals defense opened up with 2 punts. It was really nice. And after that, the next 4 drives, touchdown, 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 field goal. Game over. Louisville loses. As much credit as I gave this defensive game plan against Clemson, there's as much criticism about this game plan against Stanford. Look, I know that early on, Stanford really wasn't able to get anything going, but they made adjustments. They didn't throw the ball downfield much. Quick throws. They dink and dunked their way down the field. And Louisville had no answer for it. The short throws, the gambles that ultimately ended up in big yardage gains, like the touchdown that made it 10-0. A gamble on jumping the route, and he basically could have somersaulted into the end zone. How many times did Louisville have a chance to get off the field this game, and they weren't able to do it? The defense was just not good. Stanford was, I'm trying to look at third down. They were 5 of 16. It's not like they were the greatest, but they were 3 of 3 on fourth down. That's a key thing. The composure. Louisville averaged something like 48 yards a game in penalty yards coming into the game. 13 penalties for 102. Stanford had 3 for 30. You can't have that and try to win a game. Like, how many were just ill-advised? The face mask call on the sack. You didn't even need to grab his face mask. The ineligible man downfield, illegal use of hands, the unacceptable personal foul, unnecessary roughness after the play was over that would have sent the game to overtime. Instead, you give Stanford the opportunity to kick a game-winning field goal. And if you're one of those people that said, well, it was kind of a weak call, I don't care. You don't put yourself in a situation where the referee can even make that interpretation. You have to know it's unacceptable. Part of that's on the player for making the mistake. Part of that's on coaching because composure was key. Urgency, a lack of urgency. You had a huge win against Clemson. It looked like this team just overlooked Stanford from the beginning to the end. The situational play calling was rough. The offensive execution at the end of the game where you had multiple 14-point leads and you weren't able to keep it. Same thing goes with the defense. Like, I don't look at one thing like, yeah, sure, you scored 35. You did it without Isaac Brown for much of the game. Congratulations. When you needed to move the ball the most, and I know I'm being very critical, and I'm doing my best to be fair in criticism. But if you're one of those people that are sitting here listening, thinking, "Well, why are you?" I feel like you're criticizing too much. You lose to a 2-7 team that was uncompetitive more often than not over the past 6 games, and you're ranked. There's going to be a lot of criticism. Again, these next 2 games are very critical. Very critical. I don't even know how to begin to look at this Pittsburgh game because what Louisville team is going to show up? That's the main thing. Again, win or lose, we still love our team. We still love our Cardinals. I wouldn't be as mad as I am if I didn't care so much about this team. I know that this team can turn things around because we saw what they did against Clemson. But we had to have a very honest conversation. And I'm hoping that that's what's happening in that locker room all of this week. So that is going to wrap up this Sunday edition of the show. We're going to be back here on Monday discussing more about what happens next, what changes need to be made, and much more. So be sure to stay tuned. We'll see you back here very soon.